In this lecture video, we'll be talking about enumeration, or how we count things up. Specifically, we'll have an example of one sample estimation and an example of two sample estimation. For our first example, we'll look at a jar of gumballs of two different colors. Suppose a teacher holds up a jar of 200 blue and orange gumballs in front of their class. The teacher asks the students to determine how many blue and how many orange gumballs are in the jar. With data, we are always interested in what's called a population. A population is the set of individuals that are being enumerated. This could be humans, animals, or inanimate objects like gumballs. In this example, the population is all gumballs in the jar. We also need our N value. That's the number of individuals in a given population. In our gumball example, that's the number of gumballs in the jar, or N equals 200. First, a student's going to pull out 40 gumballs, and from those 40, they find out that there are 14 blue and 26 orange gumballs. They then use this information to make their best guess as to how many blue and how many orange are in the entire jar. When the student pulled out 40 gumballs out of the 200, this is called a sample. Specifically, a sample is a subset of the population chosen to be the providers of information in a survey. That is, we're trying to find out information about all 200 of the gumballs, but we're going to look at a sample of 40 of them to give us information about the 200. Our sample here is the 40 gumballs that were selected by this first student. This brings us to something called a statistic. A statistic is a numerical estimate of some measurable characteristic of a population that's been obtained from a sample. Let's focus on how many blue gumballs are in this sample. Out of the 40 gumballs pulled, 14 of them are blue. And we're assuming that that's going to be approximately equal to the same proportion of how many blue gumballs are in the entire jar of 200. Multiplying both sides by 200 and flipping this around just a little, we find an approximation for x as 14 over 40 times 200. Or we find a best guess for x in this case to be 70. That is, using this sample, we make an estimate that there's about 70 blue gumballs in the entire jar of 200, because out of 40, there were 14. That brings us to this idea of a survey. A survey is a data collection strategy that uses a sample to draw inferences about a population. In this case, we used information about our sample that 14 out of 40 were blue to infer that about 70 out of 200 would be blue. This is also what we call one sample estimation. We pulled one sample from the population and used that to estimate information about the whole population. Now let's talk about our second student. A second student comes along and decides to just dump out the whole jar of gumballs and count all the blue and orange. When they do this, they find that there are 65 blue and 135 orange gumballs. This idea of counting up all of the gumballs is what we call a census. That's a complete enumeration of a population. You take every single individual in the population into consideration. It's no longer an estimate, you actually counted. The results that we get from the census are called a parameter. We found that there were 65 blue and 135 orange. Those are exact values, or a true measurement of some characteristic of a population. One way to remember the difference between a statistic and a parameter is to think sample, statistic, population, parameter. If you're using values from a sample, your results are a statistic. If you're using the results from a census and looking at the entire population, you have yourself a parameter. This brings us to two different students with two different answers. One student spent a lot less time, but only has an approximation. The other student spent a whole lot more time, but they have an exact answer. The difference between a parameter and a statistic is called the sampling error. The student that dumped out all of the gumballs and counted has a parameter, which is the true value, while the student that used a sample has a statistic, which is an approximation or estimate. In order to calculate the sampling error for the student that pulled the sample, we take the statistic of 70 blue gumballs and subtract from that the parameter, the actual amount of 65 blue gumballs. This gives us a sampling error of 5. We were over by 5 gumballs with this estimation. Now let's look at a different example. In this next example, we have a different scenario. We're going to talk about how to figure out how many fish are in a pond. Clearly, this is a little different from our previous example with gumballs, where we could just dump them out and count them up. We will have to figure out a way to estimate. First, 500 fish are captured from a small pond. These 500 fish are then tagged and then released back into the pond. A few days later, another 120 fish are captured. And of those fish, 30 of them have tags from the previous capture, while the rest of them do not. So from this information, how many fish do you think are in the pond? This process is what we call two-sample estimation, or capture-recapture. It's a method for estimating the size of a population using two samples. Step 1 in this process is the initial capture, and we label the number in the first capture with N1. So in this case, N1 is equal to 500, that first group of 500 fish that were captured. The second step is the recapture. In our recapture, we had 120 fish, and we label that as N2. In this recapture, we found that 30 of the fish were already tagged from the first capture. We label that value with K. So in this case, K is equal to 30. Step 3 is to use our values from step 1 and 2 and calculate our estimation for the size of the population. We do this by setting up a proportion. That's K over N2 equals N1 over capital N. Capital N is what we're looking for. That's the size of the entire population, the N value. Filling in with our values, we have 30 over 120 is equal to 500 over N. Doing a little simplifying and multiplying both sides by N, we have that 1/4 times N is equal to 500. Multiplying both sides by 4, we have our estimation for N. N is approximately equal to 2,000. So our best estimation is that there's approximately 2,000 fish in this pond. Let's look at one last example to help us with a few more definitions. Suppose a polling company wants to determine who the winning candidate in a presidential election will be. They hire professional interviewers to call and interview registered voters. Sampling frame is what we call the population from which the sample is drawn. In this example, they only called registered voters. So our sampling frame is registered voters. That's the population from which they pulled their sample. Sampling proportion is the percentage or proportion of the population represented by the sample. That would be the number surveyed divided by the number of registered voters. The target population is a little different. That's the population to which the conclusions of the survey will apply. The results of this survey apply to all people that are going to vote, the candidates themselves, and many others. We often want to compare the sampling frame to the target population. The goal is often to have the sampling frame and the target population line up as much as possible, but that's not always the case. Sampling variability is the natural variability in the statistics obtained by different samples of the same population, even when the samples are chosen using the same methodology. We see this all the time with political polls. Two different polling companies can pull samples from the same population, but they rarely have the exact same results. And that will conclude this lecture video on enumeration. We spent quite a bit of time on one sample estimation and two sample estimation, and included quite a few terms and definitions.